Well, happy Sabbath. Good afternoon to all. With this being Father's Day weekend, I would like to thank the fathers. I would traditionally give a message, something about fathers, but I'd like to note that there's another event happening this weekend. So instead of a Father's Day message, that event is summer camps are about to start. So for the youth that have helped make some of us fathers, this is for you. Now, it's applicable to all of us, but I thought it would be especially helpful, maybe and encouraging, before our youth go to camp. Brene Brown is a self-labeled researcher and storyteller. Brene Brown, on her website, it's Brene, B as in boy, R-E-N-E, Brown.com, states what I'm guessing would be her motto. Big words, front page. Keeping it awkward, brave, and kind. We don't normally hear those three words together. Awkward, brave, and kind. She spent the last 2 decades studying courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. And she asks a question, and she's available on several different YouTube videos, and you could do some searches for this if you'd like. The question is, what is the difference between fitting in and belonging? What is the difference between fitting in and belonging? So today I would like to tailor that question to us as Christians and ask, as Christians, should we fit in or belong? We'll focus on one verse, 2 key words, and then wrap this up. But before that, let's get an initial definition around the terms fitting in and belonging. So what's the difference between the two? Well, fitting in is becoming who you think you need to be in order to be accepted. A lot of peer pressure creates a desire to want to fit in. Fitting in could be how people dress, how people look, how people act, the things people say. So fitting in can be focused on outward activity to want to be a part of a surrounding. Peer pressure is interesting. There's a natural gravitation to the mean, average, which isn't always good. Peer pressure can cause a variety of odd behaviors that a person could look back on and say, what was I thinking? What did I do that for? So I'll wrap up just this first initial thought about what fitting in is. So it's assessing a situation, becoming who you need to be accepted, and it's really seeking friends. And I'll remind us of a quote I've shared a little bit in the past, but I think it's a good one to be reminded of. Jim Rohn says that we'll become the average of our 5 closest friends. So thinking that there's a natural desire to fit in, if you can think who your 5 closest friends are. If you don't have 5, that's okay. You've got a couple. If you don't have any, ask God for help, but choose friends. And it also is okay if you don't have a good set of friends to find new friends. But fitting in is an important thing to consider your surroundings. Now let's compare and contrast that with belonging. So belonging is being accepted for who I am. Now it dates me, but back when I was growing up, there was a cartoon called Popeye. Some of you might remember Popeye the Sailor Man. And Popeye the Sailor Man would say, I am what I am. And it's like, accept me for who I am. And that's a belonging, or a sense of belonging, is that a person is then being accepted for who they are. Brene Brown mentions that sometimes we'll take fitting in as a substitute, but actually fitting in is the greatest barrier to belonging, because fitting in is trying to be something that we're not versus being accepted for who we are. So it's being our authentic self. So with that as the background, let's turn to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, and let's start in verse 1. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren. And beseech can be urge, it can be ask, it could be command. But I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God. It's your reasonable service. The word reasonable comes from a Greek word that means logic. It's logical. It's reasonable. It makes sense. It's sensible for this service. And what is this service? to not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So what I'd like to do now is we're going to focus on those two words. What's the difference between conforming, which I believe ties directly to fitting in, and transforming, which ultimately belongs to all of us as a part of belonging. So with the wonders of modern technology, if we could ask for the slides, please. I have a complicated slideshow. 3 slides, not that complicated. But what I'd like to do is to highlight what's the difference in the words and what's the difference in the meanings for transform and conform, and then apply this to camp and beyond. So, conform, the Greek word schematizo. Not really important, other than I would just highlight the middle part, schema, S-C-H-E-M-A. Does that remind you of any words? Schematics, a blueprint. It's the outline, it's the form, it's an outer shape. So we're not supposed to conform to the world. Think about the word schema here. It's also translated sometimes fashion, which would make sense, fitting in and fashion, and don't conform to this world, but then to be transformed. Now, a couple of items on this word conform. Barclays, on this section in Romans 12, says that these two words, conform and transform, are nearly untranslatable. It takes many sentences to try to explain each. To fashion alike is one way, to conform to the same pattern. Another explanation is it's like a chameleon. What does a chameleon do? A chameleon can change colors wherever it's at. Is a chameleon green? If it's sitting on a green leaf, a chameleon's green. But a chameleon can change colors based on the environment. That's similar to this word conform. But now let's go to slide 2, please. So here's a picture. You may or may not recognize the creature on the screen. As a small hint, I grew up in northern Indiana. I was just there, and I saw what one of these turns into just yesterday. It's a caterpillar, not just any type of caterpillar. This becomes a monarch butterfly. It only takes about a month for this to turn into a monarch butterfly, but that's transformation. That's changing the form opposed to just changing the outline. This word transform, metamorpho, which is just a fun word to say, and you can imagine there's some other words that come from that. It also is translated in the Bible, the same word, transfigure. So the transfiguration in Matthew, Jesus Christ, his face shone like the sun, his clothes became white as light. He was transformed, transfigured. I have a little bit of fun with this caterpillar. You might consider it a worm. In the Old Testament, both Job and David said, we're all a worm or less than a worm. So we all have a common starting point. There's none of us that should say, I've got better colors than you as a worm as a starting point. We all have a common starting point, but we all have an exciting finishing point that's much beyond that worm. Barclays also highlights that the schema for each of us can change. Our schemas change from a 17-year-old to a 70-year-old. A few more wrinkles, a few more changes. The part in my hair has gotten a little wider. So the schema, the outer appearance changes. The substance hopefully is changing along as well, but the substance is our inner part, our inner being. So that's typically much more consistent. But now I'd like to go to the third slide. Thank you very much. So let's talk about the circle of life. The circle of life for a butterfly. A butterfly lays an egg. Those eggs are not big. It's supposed to be the size of a pin, the head of a pin. So the egg is just a pin head. Then it becomes a larva. The egg turns into the baby caterpillar. That baby caterpillar that starts so tiny, in the matter of a few weeks, it has one job, to eat. That's all it has to do. It has to eat and eat and eat. Every day, all day long, until it takes a break. It sheds its skin 5 different times because it's growing so fast. In a couple of weeks, the caterpillar grows in size by 100 times. The little head of a pin becomes that caterpillar on the far left. Just a couple of weeks, growing 100 times. Then it becomes a cocoon. You can see in the center picture the beginning of a cocoon, And that cocoon, you can see how the butterfly is morphing and changing inside the cocoon. That's transformation. That's changing. And then it becomes that wonderful, beautiful butterfly, in this case, a monarch butterfly. Butterflies only live for a few weeks. They go lay some eggs. And that cycle goes again. So to have an egg turn into a caterpillar, to eat 100 times, or to grow, it eats so much to grow 100 times its size, and then turn into a wonderful butterfly, it's an amazing comparison to what we should be going through as a transformation today for ourselves, but then ultimately what the wonderful transformation of the future will be. So now let's go back to Romans 12. So let's go back to verse 2 to start with. So we know that we're not to be conformed to the world. Don't change our language, our dress, our actions to just conform to the world, but let's be transformed. How are we to be transformed? By the renewing of our mind. So that's asking God for help. Renewing, and our minds can be washed by the water of the word, so reading the Bible can help, but renewing our minds that we can prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For grins, I'll just continue to read verse 3. For I say through the grace given to me to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Now, I don't know when Paul was writing this if he had just thought, I just wrote about metamorpho. I just wrote about a butterfly and how a worm turns into a wonderful butterfly and that we need to transform ourselves. Let's not forget, there's no reason for us to think more highly of ourselves than we should be. I don't know if he was referring to that or not. I think for a purpose of this message, it certainly can apply. There's no reason for ourselves to think more highly of ourselves, but we should be focusing on transforming into that beautiful butterfly ahead. I'd like to read this in the New Living Translation. It says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So we know that we're not to conform to the world. We're supposed to live in the world but not be of the world. Here's a question. Is it ever okay to conform? Let's turn to Philippians chapter 3, and let's start with verse 20. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20, and it says, for our citizenship is in heaven, and this is from the New King James, and I'll give a couple of an extra translation for clarity. But for our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly wait for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, what will Jesus Christ do? He will transform our lowly body, so moving from the caterpillar to eventually that butterfly, that it might be conformed to his glorious body, according to the working by which he is able even to subdue all things. So on the question, is it okay to conform? I would propose that the answer is, it depends. If we're conforming to the world, not good. If we're conforming to Christ, absolutely, nobody would have an issue with that, I would think, or should. So the idea here in the King James, that first word transform is also just labeled change. And then in the King James, the conformed is labeled fashioned. But I think that it generates the general premise or thought that we can want and should want to transform ourselves and have Christ help us transform to be like him, but we should be okay to be conformed to be like Christ. A quote from Brene Brown, belonging is the innate human desire to be a part of something larger than us. And because this yearning is so important, we often try to acquire it by fitting in and seeking approval, which are not only hollow substitutes for belonging, but often barriers to it. So now let's apply this to camp. At camp, our youth have an incredible opportunity to consider, are you going to conform or not? Are you there to transform or not? There's the thing called the zone. And I see some nods and smiles. The zone's an incredible thing. The zone's not there in the world. A chance that if a child or a youth tries to do their best and something doesn't work out, nobody has to worry about being made fun of. Nobody has to worry about mean words. The zone is about encouragement. Do your best. Be your best. No regrets. Go for more. So it's only encouragement. Think about conforming. At camp, everybody's on the same schedule in your dorm. You're eating the same meals. You're doing the same activities. And even horror of horrors, you're wearing the same T-shirts. you're conforming in that environment, not a bad thing. So in that case, conforming in a positive environment is good. Separately, you should be there, and it should be transformational. I've heard many a story of many a child, and I would say we could have similar stories of coming back from camp was a very impressionable, important moment in their life. And they came back from camp wanting to make decisions and choices that were life-changing. So I would encourage each of you as a camper or those helping with camp, you're helping with this fitting in and belonging process, but also us as Christians to consider how this applies to our lives. So in conclusion, the message started with a question. What's the difference between fitting in and belonging? I think biblically we can say it's conforming and transforming. Could be a comparison. The real answer to that is it depends. Where, with whom, what's the ideal situation if we should do that and consider that as a Christian. Belonging is being our authentic self on our journey that can be similar to transforming. We should seek to conform to Christ, not the world, and we should seek to be transformed by the renewing renovation of our mind, that we may prove the good and acceptable, perfect will of God.